Welcome to Rooted. Welcome to my yellow bench. In today's episode, I'm joined by Andrew Bowley, and he has a 39-year career in and around investment banking behind him. He's just made a change, really, to step away from that world and go into advisory work and board work. And it's really interesting to talk to somebody who's had that scale and that depth of a career behind them. He's had all kinds of executive and non-executive positions in his career, and I think you'll really enjoy this one because it's somebody who's come to sustainability relatively late in their career, but brings with them such a kind of depth and a breadth of detail about how organisations work, how banks work in particular, and how to best harness that knowledge to make really big transformational change. And it's actually a real hopeful episode. I left the conversation feeling really positive and really kind of fired up with the scale of transformation that's possible. So enjoy the episode. Let me know what you think. So today's guest on Rooted has spent just shy of 40 years in and around investment banking, doing a whole range of executive and non-exec roles globally. Most notably from a sustainability perspective, he was responsible for international sustainability strategy at Nomura, the Japanese bank, and was international head of sustainability at Wells Fargo. Now, earlier this year, he took a step towards something new and is building out a portfolio career, including advisory and thought leadership through his company BowleyFI, which stands for Finance with Impact. He's also a listener of Rooted, a regular listener of Rooted, and has been giving me lots of lovely feedback and encouragement all the way since we started this last year. So I'm immensely grateful to you for that, Andrew. And Andrew, welcome to Rooted.
No, thanks so much, Liv, and congratulations, of course, on all those other podcasts. You know, the thing I really love about them is just having that experience of other people's journeys. And I think my comment right at the start was, wow, this is interesting because it's a different journey to the one I've had. Yeah. And I'm really excited to really get stuck into that because this is the first time we've talked. So we've been messaging back and forth for a little while now, but this is the first time we've really talked, and I will have really got to hear that story. And the way that you describe it as coming into the sustainability world relatively late in the career, but obviously being fired up by it. So really looking forward to chatting with you about that in today's conversation. Shall we make a start? Shall we start at the beginning? So I normally ask at this point, where your roots in this work began. And I think what I'm really interested to hear from you is where and how you made that switch into sustainability in those latter roles in your career, because you really were investment banking through and through up until, was it at Nomura where you made that switch? It was 2019. And no, you're absolutely right. I've had quite a journey through mainly kind of the market side of investment banking. And it's been a long journey. I started my first internship in 1987. I was at Lehman Brothers and saw the events around that and was part of the transition from Lehman into Nomura. There was about 8,000 people that made that switch at the time. But by the time we got to 2019, I'd made a couple of career pivots and had enjoyed doing that, changing topic and thinking, okay, it's going to be better for me for the future to have more experience. So sort of between, for example, the equity asset class and fixed income in banking. And I found myself in the inner circle of the head of the investment bank. And it was almost a side conversation saying, oh, Andrew, look, we really need to spend some time on sustainability. Can you have a look at it? And it was one of those kind of real blank pieces of paper, go figure it out.
And for you, it was a blank piece of paper, so it wasn't something that you've been wanting to get into or had as in the back of your mind as a plan. It was more here's something, are you interested?
Yeah, it really was, and I was interested, and I really enjoyed learning around it. But I think it's worth, if I think backwards to how my career had led towards that, I would describe myself as someone who's kind of in the weeds, right? I know how things work. I'm always, even at home, I'm sort of dismantling things and rebuilding them. If something goes wrong, I'll try and fix it myself. And I always love and have pride in knowing how things all hang together. So when you're in finance, it's almost still like a production line, right? There's still different departments and different functions, so they all hang together to make this thing work. In fact, I love reading as well, and one of the quotes I remember from a book I read a long time ago, which was about the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and John Pierpont Morgan himself said, I could sit at any person's desk and finish their job. He didn't allow anyone to be in the bank who he didn't understand what they did, and that sort of resonates with me a lot. So I've always had this kind of product development, building new businesses, and sustainability felt like one of those. So that was the thing that really piqued my interest straight away, was that it fitted with what I'd done before, and was about sort of unpicking and rebuilding the bank in a different way. Yeah, and I think for me, that's really what sustainability is and should be about.
So it's really about the way the organization works and re-engineering it almost for a different world or a different risk.
It really is, and it's very easy when you look at outside in commentary in financial services about how banks need to lend less to the oil and gas sectors and lend more to renewables, for instance, in the energy space. But it's not an easy and it's not a straightforward change. And you don't win battles by just banging that drum at the top of the bank. You actually have to think about, how does the bank actually operate? What's its strengths and weaknesses? What new capabilities might it need to bring in to achieve that ultimate aim? And that's why I love the fact that I've had that long career understanding exactly how the banks work, so that I could kind of come in almost, and it became a lot easier to then re-engineer and redesign and rebuild. And actually, between Nomura as a Japanese bank, Wells Fargo as an American bank, they're actually quite different in terms of the way they're structured as well. So I'm really pleased I made that switch, for example, and I've experienced that from two different banks and be able to succeed in two different places. Yes. With a slightly different lens.
Yeah. So it seems like a real kind of a curiosity, in a sense, to kind of to understand and to re-engineer and to solve a problem seems to have really been driving some of that.
Yes, it was that. And I think also it's worth highlighting for Nomura as a bank. In 2019, they were at the time 6 years ahead of their centenary, and sort of classic, without trying to plan for 100 years, there was this mindset of, how do we go into the next centenary with giving ourselves the best chance? And as we just debated the future, we really landed on two economic megatrends, and one, we use the label of sustainability, but we actually really mean energy transition, decarbonisation, and deep change there. The other happened to be kind of digital and crypto and blockchain and AI. And the bank invested very heavily in both of those. And for me, some people went one way, I went the other. It was great to sort of take that leadership on sustainability, and with this real sort of long-term investment in mind. So that really kind of made this an exciting and opportunistic place to be, because the firm really believed in thinking about how the economy was going to change. And the next 10, 20, 30 years are really going to be defined by a huge transformation in every industry.
I think you said you'd heard the conversation that I had with Martin Wayman
Yes.
on this podcast, and we had quite an interesting chat. Part of our chat was about, I guess, his hopes and his ambitions for the role that he was about to start at Riva Group. And for him, it was all about that idea of, again, like re-engineering the way that the organisation works, like really embedding sustainability into every part of the organisation, and that it must be a cross-functional endeavour, and it must be sort of really in the processes, in the weeds, in the governance, in the detail, and that although it doesn't necessarily look shiny and glamorous and like something you can point to and say, look at this, that actually is super fulfilling and satisfying. Did you resonate with that bit of that conversation? Because that sort of sounds a bit like what you're saying.
Yeah, no, totally. For me, that's the real passion, is being able to kind of think that the underlying economy of the world is changing, and that you can take a leadership role in re-engineering how a bank is interacting with that.
So you'll know from when I talk to people that often there's some seeds in their early life of I was always passionate about the natural world or marine environment or whatever. Did you have that? Do you bring with you a sense of that kind of physical world that we're trying to protect, the activism? Is there a thread of that in your story, or is it really a business problem that you're coming to this as?
I think, to be fair to myself, I'd say it's primarily the business problem, but I do have perhaps a couple of threads there. One, so I grew up in Hong Kong. I did a lot of sailing out there. One of my kind of real heroes in this world is Ellen MacArthur. She, famously broke the world record for solo circumnavigation. And very curiously, at a young age, she stopped sailing very, very quickly. And rather than just continuing as many others would do as a career in that, she sort of hit this moment during her voyage where she realised the scarcity of the resources she had. And in that particular story, it was the scarcity of the resources she had on the boat. Her circumnavigation was 74 days. She had a leak in her generator from oil, and then she had a choice with her cooking oil to either use it in the generator or to use it in her cooking. She couldn't do both. And she went on from that to start the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is effectively the leading organisation in circular economy. And that kind of story and that kind of experience has absolutely resonated with me. I think as well, there's a real sort of sort of touch on anxiety and so on, but the kind of fear and worry that we don't, as humans, truly appreciate what is ahead of us. And I remember, I studied at university. I studied economics, and you have these concepts. You sort of remember all these parabolic curves of equilibriums, supply and demand equilibriums. And when you think about climate, you think climate is quite an equilibrium, and humans are disrupting that. And it really struck me quite quickly around sort of tipping points and so on, that we're on a dangerous path if we don't collectively get to grips with this. And I think that sort of discovering and reading and learning more on that topic, in particular around the time that I was trying to really get my head around this in 2019, really kind of shook me into action and wanting to do more.
Let's talk about that time then. So the time that you spent at Nomura, the time you spent at Wells Fargo, those roles where you were leading sustainability work. What as you look up on that time and those roles, what do you feel most proud of? Where do you think you made the most impact?
Yeah, I think Liv, the easy answer to that would be to say, well, it was my time at Nomura because we achieved so much. But I think actually, as I sit back now, looking back on both organisations, it is actually a combination of both, because I was able to take a leadership role in both organisations, but also to take a bit of a blueprint and make a difference in both. One was a very receptive organisation that really wanted to set themselves up well for the long-term future. The other, of course, is influenced by a lot of dynamics in America at the moment, and that was always the backdrop of that particular journey. But in both cases, I sort of went in with a view as to how I wanted to organise things. So, right, kind of in simple terms, I'm in charge. I'm going to drive this, but I've got to get the shape right. And if I don't get the shape of the structure right in the first place, it won't fit, and you'll create tension and conflict and problems for yourself down the line. So I think in both cases, for me, getting it's almost like the G of the governance, ESG. It's getting the governance model right in a way that allowed the organisation to move as efficiently as it could.
What was the model? What was the sort of idea that you were trying to?
In fact, we had a long debate at Nomura, and I championed one view, and we had a business leader who had the opposite view, and we kind of fought this out. And in simple terms, we called it sort of the vertical model and the horizontal model. So the vertical model was to say that sustainability needs to be a business in its own right. It needs to have its own P&L, its own headcount, and it was a vertical slice through an organisation chart, if you like. Whereas my view was, look, the reason we're coming into this so aggressively is because we see it as being a whole economy change. So if you isolate it to one business, you're going to limit yourself. So I really championed this sort of view that it should be a horizontal. It should, again, if you're visualizing an organization chart in front of you, sustainability should spread right horizontally, right across everyone and every part. And not try and sort of be its own P&L, not sort of dominate the organization in that sort of way, but to bring everyone together. So actually in both organizations, I created sustainability forums that were business people only and included senior people. So heads of sales, heads of trading, heads of distribution, energy sector heads, but business leads from all of these different components of the organization, brought them together and then thought together about how our different businesses interact and work together. And, controversially to some, I excluded all the sort of support functions. So I sort of put, compliance, lawyers, accountants, and so on into a different discussion forum. So when we thought about, the regulations we have to comply with and the reporting we need to do, that was a bit of a separate conversation, and I didn't want to pollute them too much, least of which is just the psyche that if you fill a room full of accountants and lawyers, the business guys don't turn up. So there's a little bit of playing on the known psyche. And again, where I've been in the past, right, I know what works in a bank.
Yeah. And the conversation is, if you have a conversation in which part of the agenda is the legal obligations, the reporting requirements and all of that, it because that is the absolute must do, that the kind of imperative, like we have to do a report, we have to comply with this, then it dominates. Like I think that can dominate the conversation in a way that doesn't then allow for this sort of more transformational conversation to take place with the business leads.
It's only when you bring all these disparate parts of the business together that you realize these opportunities. At Wells Fargo, we found a person in Frankfurt who does distribution to insurance companies, and they're the best organization to take some of these long-term annuities, stable, lower risk, lower return, green assets is exactly what an insurance company is looking for, not necessarily what a bank is looking for. So, it's really bringing those different bits of expertise and experience together and not thinking of sustainability as just a regulatory change, as something the regulators are doing to us, and not thinking about it narrowly as being, well, it's just about green bonds and social bonds, just a narrower product class.
Yeah, so a real breadth and a real kind of I'm almost, as you're talking, I'm imagining the kind of the tentacles going out and kind of being in every part of the organisation, and that's the bit that you've enjoyed in both of those roles, is kind of seeing that impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, you've hit the nail on the head there, because it's really about changing as much of the organisation as you can. Yeah, and it's very easy to use that sort of classic metaphor of a super tanker that you're trying to nudge. My father was in shipping, and we used to look out the window in Hong Kong, and we lived on the south side of the island. And my dad used to say, look, the guys are switching their engines off now. They've still got to go all the way around the island, but they just glided in because there's so much momentum in these super tankers that they just carry on. And and banks are just the same. They're designed in a certain way. They make risk decisions in a certain way, and the bigger change you can make across the broader part of the organisation, the more impact you are going to have individually. And I think that's the bit I'm proud of, is being able to have that bigger, wider impact.
Is that the kind of work you'd love to do more of in your advisory role now? Is that the kind of, is that what you're hoping to really get stuck into?
Yeah, absolutely. We did so much, and if I think about actually making the change I did from Nomura to Wells Fargo, by the time I'd left Nomura, I'd taken the firm into the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I'd set sustainability targets. I'd taken them into the Principles of Responsible Banking, been part of the team that did 4 TCFD reports, and we had this perfect structure. And actually, Nomura made a huge acquisition, which is a company called Green Tech, and made that its primary kind of mergers and acquisitions advisory team within the organisation. Almost felt like everything had been done. So I kind of, it was nice to move on to a different organisation and that was further behind, and bring them up. And I think I can sort of take that model forward by sort of advising and guiding rather than necessarily being employed. And I think that's the bit that I'm sort of looking forward to now, is like I could park the full-time employment and then just do a bit more of the fun stuff and the advisory, and ideally be able to help and support more organisations in thinking about change in a really deep way.
Yeah, and it's so we're not talking necessarily here about going in and just doing a spot piece of work in one part of an organisation. We're talking about how we can embed something across an organisation, and within the real fabric of it is the bit that's really, really satisfying work to do.
And I do think when you start looking at boards and you're looking at chief execs and senior leaders, they for them, there is so much going on in life that sustainability is perhaps not something they thought about as deeply as they ought to have done. And it's still remarkable now, right? Every day when you read the news, you see sort of surprise and unpreparedness around moves into this space. How are different sectors going to change? You mentioned, Martin, in your last talking about the transport sector, but energy, transport, manufacturing, everything is going to change, and that just means so much. And if that hasn't hit home and landed at the top of an organisation, then they're potentially in trouble, because they're not able to think as strategically as they should do.
I'm just interrupting the proceedings a little bit because, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because my producer and editor of this podcast, who also happens to be my husband, John Cropper, has told me that I should interrupt proceedings a bit with some sort of like reflection, just like Adam Buxton does. And if I do that a bit more often, my podcast may just be as successful as Adam Buxton. So here goes. I'm interrupting really just to say, if you like this part of the conversation where Andrew and I are talking about this idea of really kind of transforming organisations by getting into the weeds of how an organisation works and how it ticks, really, then I really would recommend you also queue up my conversation with Martin Wayman, who's just started in his new role as Director of Sustainability at Ariva, because he and I actually talk quite a bit more on this subject in that conversation as well. So just make a note to queue that one up and listen to that one next if you haven't already heard it. Back to the show. I wonder if we can turn our thinking, this is the human side, so I'm going to dig a bit deeper here, to the times that have been tougher. As you looked, through your whole career, whether in that more recent bit in sustainability or beyond, but what's been the real trickiest times, would you say, as you look back on what you've done so far?
Yeah, the interesting thing, actually, when I reflect back, is that a lot of it coincides with the good times. And today I would use the word anxiety a lot. I've kind of struggled at points in my career with that. I used to call it confidence. You sort of think about confidence in terms of whether it's speaking or pushing yourself, but now we'd normally use that word anxiety. But I've always, as you get to bigger and bigger roles, I've always had that sort of worry of, am I doing it right? Am I getting to the right place? Am I, what problems could I be setting on the organisation if I get this wrong? When it's so big and important and strategic. So I've really struggled to kind of get the balance between the two, and perhaps something now and again, it's great to have these kind of conversations because it makes you stop and think about it. But I've turned anxiety into a bit of a superpower, which is just attention to detail and hard work. So when I think about doing my A-levels or at university, I would panic about an exam and then I would just double down on work and make sure I delivered. And I've always sort of done that in my career, which is I sort of panic and worry about, have I done enough? Have I missed anything? Is there anything that I've overlooked that could go wrong? And ended up sort of doubling down and working harder to make it so. And, whilst I talk about the achievements, for instance, at Nomura, we had quite a battle over what is the right structure. And, as it happens, when sort of talking to people with very senior roles, years of experience, in this case, previous chief exec, who had a different vision to you, that's quite hard sort of psychologically to push through and sort of have confidence in yourself that, what you're thinking is right. And for me, it meant I was then just throwing myself deeper and deeper into it all. So working harder.
You wanted to make sure that you had a good argument back as such. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And also just to make sure that it's not just having the argument, but actually believing it myself. So persuading myself that I was right. So, that's almost taking it to another layer of detail of, I really, really want to dig into this. I really want to study it from every angle, talk to as many people as I can about the options. But it becomes scary. And, even it's interesting. I was doing this conference last week and I said to someone, oh, yeah, this is great fun, but I was a bit nervous coming into it. And they sort of looked at me with a strange look and said, well, I wouldn't say for a minute you looked nervous. You looked absolutely on top of your game. And that's the balance I've always found I've managed to get to, which is to use the nerves, the anxiety to supercharge myself to make sure it is okay.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because there'll be people that were looking at you on that stage in front of all those people thinking, oh God, I could never be as confident as that. And, you know, little do we know that, yeah, the guy that's just got on the stage confidently has just been having a little moment, you know, kind of giving himself a talking to beforehand or whatever. Because, yeah, it does take a lot to come on there and be polished and be confident and all of those things. When you were talking then, though, I have to say there was a little bit of my head, and anyone who kind of knows me well will kind of know this little alarm bell was almost going off when you were saying that you kind of almost double down on the work, and I can see that there's an element where that sense of doubt, you know, can bring in a superpower type quality of I'm going to make sure this is really good, and that can drive you to do great things. But it can also be a downfall. And some people, and I would put myself in this category, can allow that sort of perfectionism, trying to get control, trying to feel like it's all good, you know, can allow it to spiral into something that's really quite damaging and unhelpful and you know, best case scenario, just a bit exhausting. Do you find yourself with that drive to make it as good as it can be, sometimes it becomes exhausting?
I think I've always tried to find the right balance, because the reality is, Liv, you're absolutely spot on. You know, I've seen both sides of it. I've seen times where that doubling down has led to tremendous success, and you know, I think just even the longevity of being in and around financial services for 39 years, and to kind of survive, if you like, as a managing director for 16 years. You know, it's always felt like that's the upside of that journey. But you know, I've experienced the other side as well. I've had those dark times and the really difficult times, and I've, you know, kind of broken myself, if you like, in former roles where that hasn't worked, and it's really tough. People need to find that balance, though. You know, if I think last week, you know, I was chairing a conference in front of 250 people. Brilliant. I didn't need to do that. You know, I'm sort of semi-retired. I can just sit back and just pick and choose what I do. But I think I still want to keep pushing myself. But I know I have that risk. So it's exactly that balance that you've got to kind of nurture and avoid that concern over what could happen to dominate so much that you do nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk about the difference between the kind of the stress that can become overwhelming and exhausting and cause you to have real difficult dark times, and then the more helpful stress, the sort of the healthy stress of where you're challenging yourself and you're growing. And by the sounds of it, your event last week was in that category of, you know, here's something I'm a little bit nervous of, but I'm going to put myself out there and I'm going to grow as a result. That healthy stress. But yeah, it's always keeping it. You've got to keep the self-awareness quite high when you're doing that, and you're kind of going, is this a good stress, or am I just pushing myself to make this perfect from some place of doubt or lack, or kind of I'm not good enough?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the challenge there is that to really understand where you are on that scale, you know, often you'll have needed to experience a lot of that spectrum.
Yeah.
So, you know, I kind of sit back now and think, well, I've had a good long career and I've seen both sides. I can make those judgment calls, but it's tough. I can imagine it's tough for a lot of people. And you know, we just say, I think we've got to be careful as a race that we don't sort of all kind of opt towards the easy answers at some of those tougher times.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, isn't it? You said you were at Lehman, and when I was looking at your profile and everything, you were there right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You were at the company when the whole crisis was happening. I mean, I was at Lloyd's when Lloyd's Bank went during that time, and I remember that it was on my honeymoon, I think, in fact, when the whole, you know, Lloyd's and HBOS crashed together and all that. It was a really hard time, even for somebody like me who was in kind of just the operational side of banking. I felt quite ashamed for a while to work for a bank, and I wouldn't tell people I worked for a bank for a while during that time, because there was a real hatred against bankers. Actually, how do you look back on that time? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's tough actually. I think in 2008, obviously it was September that Lehman went bankrupt, and yes, I was there. It was a very weird time actually. I remember I was on the train commuting into London, and I had the London Stock Exchange phone me up saying, Andrew, do we allow you to trade or not? You know, what do we do? There was this no one knew what to do, because the bankruptcy was midnight US time, which of course is 5 a.m. UK time. And between 5 a.m. and the markets opening was too short a period of time for anyone to really get to grips with it all. But I guess I actually haven't struggled through those kind of events in the same way that I have had, perhaps some of my personal struggles. So, as I say, I started in 87. There was Black Monday, the crash of 87. I was,
of course, yeah,
spectator of Bearings collapse. I was on the front line when Lehman collapsed, and you see these events, and I've always sort of just taken them in my stride. It's part and parcel of world. Maybe the seeing the crash of 87 all those years ago sort of set me up better to appreciate and not panic so much.
Yes, because the 2008 for me, that was my first experience, and I'd had a long time actually in working in a bank before that had happened, and it was all happy days and everything's going well, and then suddenly it's like the rug's pulled out from you. But if you begin with, okay, this can go pear-shaped, and if people, if you see it and observe it, that might, set you up for a different sort of relationship with those large crisis moments. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, everyone has different experience of what that was. I was in the equities business at the time, which was highly successful, and actually was the bit that Nomura ended up wanting to buy. And firstly, I remember it was a strange time anyway in the building. There was the famous newsreels of people walking out the building with cardboard boxes. Didn't really have many possessions. There were mostly people emptying the dispenser machines of Mars bars and Coke cans because they could on their card. And there was this weird panic across the trading floor when someone started a rumor or was nervous that all the cars in the car park underneath the building were going to get impounded by the administrators. So there was all these kind of weird things going on. It was autumn, and I remember all the contractors stopped. So the foyer of the building very quickly collected leaves, and every time someone would come in the entrance, leaves would be swirling around. You just have these kind of strange visions of what was going on at the time. But ultimately, very quickly, Nomura bought that business, and even within 1 or 2 days of the bankruptcy, there was team interviews taking place. And there may be 50 people talking to one bank and 150 talking to another bank. And ultimately, what started off as being 900 people turned into 8,000 that went to Nomura. So my personal experience wasn't tough at that time. You mentioned that sort of public opinion. That was also a bit weird, because I remember we were doing some building work, and a builder phoned up my wife and said, do you want to go ahead with the quote? And she said, well, we'll wait for a bit. He was at Lehman, it's just gone bankrupt, and we're not quite sure what happens next. And he said, I'm sorry to hear that. Heard about all the news, and we can give you a discount or something. And when you sort of talk about I didn't take that. We just kind of moved ahead in due course. But the anger at the banks didn't exist at those early stages. That kind of came later.
Maybe it did.
Yeah, came with the bailouts and everything else that were in the months after.
Yes, perhaps those are the bits that I'm that I'm remembering. I wonder as we kind of look then back across the whole of your almost 40 years in this world of investment banking, in and around that, and then, as you say, latterly in sustainability. if you were going to give some advice or some tips, perhaps for somebody who's wanting to make a relatively late sort of switch into or move into sustainability, as you did, what would be your advice or tips for them?
There's probably two things that leap out to me. One, which you'll have picked up as a theme for me, which is to really focus on the big picture. If you're at a bank and you're worried about what's happening with the recycling bins, you're looking the wrong way. Banks count their scope 1 and 2 emissions in hundreds of thousands of tons. They measure their balance sheet scope 3 in the hundreds of millions of tons. And if you really want to make an impact and you want to be looking towards that business model and where can you help change that? And I worry that there are too many people who are sort of just milling around at lower levels of organisation, not making enough of a difference, and something that is really, really important, really matters. So strive, within your capabilities and opportunities to push as hard as you can. But I think also for me, I do read a lot around a lot of topics, and that kind of curiosity and always wanting to read and learn is just so important. Sort of the data and the facts and the knowledge and experience that you can then bring to conversations, the anecdotes. I'm constantly reading data points, and when you think about those, it helps you to really convince and talk to people about the future. So again, I think be curious and learn and really explore what's going on. I've talked a fair bit about Asia, but if you look at Pakistan, India, and obviously China, it's just transformational what they're doing with electrification, and having that awareness in any business is going to be important for the future as well.
So really thinking bigger, I think, and not allowing yourself to kind of like play small in those sort of details that it can seem easy, can't it, to kind of play around with the scope 1 and 2 and those kind of things, but often it's not where the big impact's going to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you read anything recent? What have you been reading that you might like to? Can you recommend something for our?
Yeah, well, certainly in the environmental side, I've loved. There's a book called The New Map, which really explains the sort of history behind America being a petrostate and China being an electrostate, if you like, and the sort of the politics that led to that outcome, and then why that is then influencing the politics and the behaviours within those individual countries. So I love that book. Simon Sharp wrote a lovely book called 5 Times Faster, which I found really interesting, because he talks about the COP process as an ex-insider. But he talks about, he really sort of explains, what was working and was not working in that COP process. And as someone who studied economics, I did an economics degree at university, he's quite critical of economists. You can't just apply economic models to solving for climate, for example. You need to think in terms of kind of a mission-based outcome. Hence the moonshot kind of references, sort of JFK saying, like, we've got to put man on the moon and get them home. He had this lovely story within that book where he talks about cars replacing horse and cart. And you mentioned Live There carbon and sort of emissions, but his comment was it was a full story. The government was investing in the road surfaces. There was rules and regulations around these new vehicles and which side of the road they would drive and what sort of signals they would use. They didn't rely on just taxing the horse muck that came out the horses as a way to changing behaviour. And it's that sort of lovely kind of picture of thinking about the whole picture here about how change actually comes about.
What I hear though when you talk is I hear this like I hear massive optimism and hope and a sense of like realism about the challenges we face, but also about the if we can think big enough, if we can think about transforming the way that these big organizations, financial services organizations work, there is hope to sort of turn around these tankers. I do get that sense from you that you feel positive, and I guess you must do, because as you said, you're semi-retired, but you're still wanting to put your energy and your passion and your time into continuing this work.
Yeah, and there's an interesting balance there, Liv, actually, because when I look at sustainability, there's two sides, if you like. There's the the kind of climate-led imperative, and that that does bring fear. There's a lot of change which is coming, and that's going to be challenging. But the kind of economic optimism is huge. The pace of transformation is enormous. Yeah, that's the optimistic part of this, is the economy is changing at pace. So we should all look at that with great hope.
Actually, that feels like a lovely point to end our conversation on, doesn't it? Yeah, a hopeful view of possibilities for big, wide, transformational change. Very exciting. And long may you continue to work on those projects that are satisfying and bring that change that you're enjoying. So yeah, thank you, Andrew, for joining me. It's been lovely to talk to you.
No, absolutely, Liv. It's been a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, and it's great to be part of your journey as well.
So one of the things I think I'm going to take away from my conversation with Andrew just there was this idea of setting your sights really, really high in terms of being hopeful and optimistic and positive about the scale of transformation that is possible when you really get into the detail and the nuts and bolts of an organisation and change it from within. And, feeling that energy and enthusiasm from Andrew for continuing on with that work, even with that 40-year career behind him, he's still got that passion and energy to do more of that big transformational work, but also being really mindful and careful about making sure you're always in the right zone of you're being challenged and you're growing with the stressful situations that you're taking on. You're not becoming overwhelmed and unbalanced through that. And it seems like really, as Andrew looks back on that lifetime of work, there's a real balance that he's found, and he's found that calibration between always sort of trying to strive for those big things, but equally, learning when not to go too far and when not to overdo it. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you make of that part of the conversation and indeed the rest of it. And as always, please do all the things that help us spread the word about this podcast. Please do follow or subscribe. Please like the episode, add in a little comment on your platform and tell me what you think on there, or pop back over onto LinkedIn and tell me what you think there. I'd love to hear from you. And thanks as always for listening. Take care. Bye.